They said she was just another passenger, a quiet woman tucked into the shadows of a crowded vessel. They said she was an unremarkable traveler with no past worth knowing, journeying under a borrowed name. But when the Orpheus star came under attack, Captain Raphael Dalen discovered that the very survival of his crew depended on the one passenger he had been told to ignore, Alina Moskov. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Orpheus star had been built for commerce, a freighter-turned-transport ship carrying dignitaries, refugees, and military contractors across contested seas. Its decks were lined with crates disguised as trade cargo but concealing medical supplies bound for war-torn provinces. Captain Dalen had spent a decade in the Navy before turning to this work, ferrying those caught in the crossfire of shifting alliances. He had seen his share of storms, ambushes, and political betrayals, but he could read his passengers the way others read the weather. Most were frightened, some were hopeful, others hardened by exile. But one, a dark-haired woman who kept her hood low and her voice quiet, carried herself differently. She didn't cling to the railings when the waves rose. She didn't panic when the engines groaned. She didn't flinch when sailors shouted drills. She moved with the steady grace of someone trained to assess threats before they arrived. Her papers said her name was Mira Kovalenko. She claimed to be a translator fleeing the war. But Dalen had served long enough to know when a story was rehearsed. He noticed how her eyes lingered on the ship's defensive placements, how her stride matched the rhythm of a soldier's march, how she sat in the mess hall, always with her back to the wall. He let her be. There were always passengers with secrets, but he marked her in his mind. Alina Moskov hated that he had noticed. She had learned to erase herself, never salute, never command, never let instinct betray her past. Once she had been Colonel Alina Moskov, a decorated strategist in the Northern Coalition's defense force. She had orchestrated campaigns that shifted borders, written doctrines studied in war colleges, and walked away from battlefields haunted by the cost of her decisions. But politics had a longer reach than rifles. When she refused to follow an order that would sacrifice civilians for tactical gain, her career had ended in disgrace, her name marked for dishonor. She had fled, shedding rank and reputation alike, becoming no one. Traveling incognito was her only shield. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sea had been calm for 3 days, until the 4th night when the first signs of trouble stirred. The weather turned restless, the horizon bristling with storm clouds that swallowed the moonlight. Lookouts reported a vessel shadowing them from the east, too disciplined in its movement to be a merchant, too silent to be a patrol. Captain Dalen's instincts pricked with unease. He ordered the crew to battle stations, though he knew their defenses were little more than token. This was not a warship, it was a ferry pretending to be something sturdier. When the attack came, it was swift and surgical. Grappling lines clattered against the hull, and masked figures stormed the deck in practiced formation. These were no pirates. Their boots struck the planks in unison, their rifles swept arcs of precision, and their commands were barked in clipped, military cadence. Mercenaries, Dalen realized, trained in the art of ship seizures. They were not here for plunder, they were here for capture. Panic ripped through the passengers. Mothers shielded their children, refugees screamed, sailors fought with cutlasses and carbines, but the boarding force pressed forward without hesitation. Captain Dalen shouted orders, positioning his crew at choke points, but within minutes he could see the flaws in his defense. The enemy had studied him, anticipated him, herded him toward mistakes that would cost him control of the ship. He had been trained for naval battles, not counterinsurgency inside his own corridors. Alina watched from the shadows, her pulse hammering in her throat. Every fiber of her body urged her to stay silent, stay hidden, let fate decide. But she saw what the captain could not, the ambush unfolding, the kill zones created, the moment when the enemy would seal the lower decks and force surrender. The patterns were as clear as maps drawn on paper, and she knew, with cold certainty, that if she didn't intervene, the Orpheus star would fall before dawn. She slipped closer to the bridge, unseen in the chaos, her mind racing through contingencies. Memories long buried surged back, the geometry of conflict, the calculus of sacrifice. She could see the countermeasures, the flanking maneuvers, the ways to turn narrow corridors into traps. She could win this fight, but the cost would be her anonymity. If she stepped forward, if she gave an order, if she showed knowledge no translator should possess, then her past would ignite like gunpowder. Captain Dalen's voice cracked through the din, desperate now, hold the line, don't give them the bridge. But his men were faltering, their defense collapsing in spirals of panic. In that moment, Alina Moskov faced the choice she had sworn never to make again. Remain invisible, and let the ship drown in blood, or reveal herself, and become once more the soldier she had been. She drew in a breath, the taste of salt and smoke thick on her tongue, and made her decision. The moment Alina Moskov stepped onto the bridge, the atmosphere shifted. The sailors who had been shouting in panic froze at the sight of a passenger, forcing her way into their domain. Her hood slipped back, her eyes burning with the authority of someone who had no business being ignored. Captain Raphael Dalen spun toward her, revolver raised, his instinct to defend his command, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke with the clipped certainty of someone who had given orders on darker nights than this. If you keep your men at the port choke, you'll be overrun in 5 minutes. Collapse them to the aft corridor, block the stairwells, and reroute fire teams through the engine catwalks. Do it now, or you'll lose the ship before the next hour. The bridge fell silent. For a heartbeat, only the alarms and gunfire echoed from the decks below. Dalen narrowed his eyes, studying her face. She was supposed to be a translator, a frightened refugee, but no translator spoke like a commander under fire. Who the hell are you? He demanded, voice rough with suspicion. Someone who knows what you're about to do will get your people killed, she replied, her gaze steady. She didn't give him a name, not yet, not when names carried the weight of entire wars. She gave him only truth wrapped in urgency. Listen to me, or lose everything. He hesitated. He had spent years reading men in the middle of battle, weighing lies against survival. Something in her posture, in her tone, stripped away the possibility of deceit. She knew the enemy's patterns better than he did. Against his pride, against the instinct to resist an intruder's command, he snapped his fingers to his lieutenant. Shift the men, do as she says. The orders rippled through the crew. Reluctantly, sailors obeyed the woman they did not know, sealing corridors, rerouting defenses, forming killboxes in the narrow halls. Alina stepped to the navigation table, her fingers tracing across maps and schematics she had memorized since boarding. The ship was not designed for war, but any structure could become a fortress if the mind behind it understood pressure points. She had spent a career bending terrain, weather and machinery into weapons. Tonight would be no different. The mercenaries advanced quickly, disciplined and methodical. Their boots struck in rhythm, their calls sharp and coordinated. But the moment they entered the newly fortified corridor, they faltered. Gunfire rained down from cross angles, smoke grenades clouded their vision, and sailors they had expected to scatter instead stood firm. Alina watched the monitors, her jaw clenched, recalculating with every move the enemy made. She was back in the rhythm she thought she'd lost. Predict, counter, adapt. Dalen glanced at her between shouts to his officers. You've done this before, he said. Not quite a question. Her eyes stayed on the monitors. Once or twice. That's not something a translator says. She ignored him, because the truth was already pressing at the edge of revelation. She had fought in places he had only read about, commanded regiments whose names were etched into military archives. And though she had fled that life, the muscle memory of war never left her. She had hoped never to taste it again, yet here she was, orchestrating defenses aboard a civilian vessel because no one else knew how. The fight dragged into its second hour. The mercenaries regrouped, adjusting their tactics, probing for weaknesses. They were skilled, but their precision betrayed something Alina recognized. Their formations mirrored the training of the Eastern Dominion, a paramilitary faction known for hiring veterans of the old wars. She felt her stomach knot. If they were here, this was not a raid of chance. This was targeted. The Orpheus star carried something or someone they wanted. Captain Dalen barked a command that cut through her thoughts. They're breaching the lower deck bulkheads. If they cut through to engineering, we'll lose power. Alina's mind raced. Then make them think they want it. Pull your engineers back, let them through one layer, then seal them in the maintenance sub-level, flood it with steam. Dalen stared. That could kill them. Her gaze met his, cold and unwavering. That's the point. For the first time he saw not a refugee, not even a survivor, but a soldier. The calm ruthlessness of someone who had learned to treat battle as mathematics. He didn't like it, but he gave the order. Minutes later, the mercenaries who breached the lower decks were trapped, their shouts muffled as steam hissed through sealed doors. The tide began to shift. Panic among the passengers subsided into wary silence as word spread that the mysterious woman had turned the fight. The sailors looked to her as much as to their captain, and that shift of loyalty cut Dalen deeper than the wounds of battle. He wanted to demand answers, but the fight wasn't over. There was time later to question why this stranger carried herself like an officer. When the mercenaries finally pulled back to their vessel, retreating into the storm, the Orpheus star floated battered but unbroken. Casualties lay in the infirmary. Steel groaned under the weight of bullet holes and ruptured piping, but they were alive. And the reason they were alive stood at the center of the bridge, her hood gone, her presence undeniable. Captain Dalen turned to her, voice low with the anger of a man whose authority had been shaken. "You're going to tell me exactly who you are, and why in God's name you've been hiding it." For a long moment, Alina said nothing. The echoes of battle still clung to the air. The faces of the fallen pressed heavy on her memory. She had promised herself she would never speak her name in uniformed hulls again. Yet here she was, with no choice. "My name," she said finally, "is Alina Moskov, and you have no idea what kind of war you've just stumbled into." The name struck Captain Dalen harder than the battle had. Alina Moskov. He repeated it in his mind, searching memory, pulling from years of naval briefings and officer whispers. He had heard it before, back when the Northern Coalition still dominated the maps, when war colleges circulated her strategies as doctrine. Alina Moskov had been more than an officer. She had been the architect of campaigns that turned hopeless defenses into victories, the woman whose maps redrew borders. And then she had vanished, erased from communiques, spoken of only in cautious tones as though her very name carried treason. Now she stood before him, alive, concealed under a false identity, her hands still stained with the residue of command. "You're supposed to be dead," Dalen said at last, his voice low, edged with suspicion. Alina's eyes hardened, though her lips curved into the faintest trace of bitterness. "Aren't we all, eventually? Some of us just choose the time." The bridge was silent save for the hum of damaged generators, and the distant groan of strained metal. Officers and crew stared between them, recognition dawning in fragments. If their captain had heard of her, then surely her presence was no accident. Yet none dared speak. Alina turned her gaze to the tactical monitors, watching the storm swallow the retreating mercenary vessel. Her voice carried the weight of inevitability. They weren't raiders. That was a Dominion strike unit. They don't waste resources on random ships. They were after someone, or something. Dalen bristled. "You seem certain." "I know their training. I fought against them for years. They move like ghosts, precise, surgical. If they boarded us, it was because they believed the risk was worth it." Her eyes slid to the crates stacked in the cargo manifest, to the coded supply logs she had memorized in passing. "What are you carrying, Captain?" Dalen's jaw tightened. "Humanitarian cargo, food, medicine, refugees." Alina's stare cut through him, and he said nothing. But his silence confirmed what she already suspected. This voyage was more than it seemed. The Dominion didn't deploy strike teams for food shipments. They hunted leverage, scientists, defectors, intelligence dossiers. Something aboard the Orpheus star was valuable enough to summon blood. The captain stepped closer, his voice lowered to a harsh whisper. "You're a ghost in uniform's clothing. You think I should trust you with more than I trust my own men." She didn't flinch. "If you don't, you won't survive the next assault." The word struck him like a slap. He wanted to reject her, wanted to cling to command, but deep inside he knew she was right. The Dominion never struck once. If they had failed to take the ship tonight, they would regroup, track and return. And his sailors, brave though they were, had neither the training, nor the tactical vision to withstand another storm of that scale. Alina turned away, pulling the hood back over her dark hair. She felt the eyes of the crew pressing into her like blades. She had not wanted this, not the return to command, not the weight of decisions measured in blood. She had wanted silence, anonymity, a chance to vanish from the world she had once ruled. Yet here she was, dragged back into a war she had sworn to abandon. Later, when the bridge settled, and the injured were counted, Dalen summoned her to his quarters. The room was lined with charts, navigational logs, and half-empty glasses of rum. He poured one for himself but not for her, his eyes still sharp, as if alcohol could dull neither suspicion nor respect. "Why are you here?" he asked. Alina's voice was flat. "Because I made a mistake. Because I disobeyed orders that would have killed thousands. And because in the coalition, defying command is a death sentence, so I disappeared. And now you're on my ship," Dalen said. "Incognito, a colonel without an army." She let the words linger. They were true enough. Yet she didn't tell him about the nights spent under false names, the silence that pressed heavier than artillery fire, the gnawing ache of identity stripped away. She didn't tell him that she had boarded this ship, hoping for passage into obscurity, for one last chance at freedom from the uniform she no longer wore. "You need me," she said instead, her voice carrying iron. "If the Dominion comes again, your crew won't hold. You have discipline, yes, but not doctrine. Not the kind they're trained to dismantle. If you let me guide them, you'll live. If not," she let the implication finish itself. Dalen studied her for a long time. He saw the conviction in her gaze, the scars invisible but etched deep. He had lost men tonight, but he had also seen her save the ship with decisions made in seconds. She wasn't bluffing. Finally he leaned back, exhaling smoke from a cigar he hadn't realized he'd lit. "If you're right, if you're really who you say you are, then this ship is no longer a ferry. It's a battlefield." Alina's eyes darkened. It always was. Outside the storm raged, hiding movements beneath its veil. Somewhere in the Black Sea, another vessel prowled, waiting for dawn to bring blood again. The storm had passed, but the damage it left behind was far from over. The Resolute limped across the water, half its communications in disarray, its radar system crippled by the surging interference that still crackled across the waves. Captain Darius Flint paced the bridge like a caged predator, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the faint horizon, where enemy patrol ships prowled like wolves circling wounded prey. He had commanded warships for 20 years, faced pirates, smugglers, and rival fleets, but this was different. His crew was brave, but bravery could not repair the broken systems or calculate the enemy's moves when blind. He needed expertise beyond what his officers could offer, and that was when the thought struck him like a hammer. The quiet traveler. The woman with the air of someone who did not belong to ordinary passage. He had noticed her once in the mess hall days earlier. She spoke little, but the weight in her eyes had unsettled him. Most passengers wore fatigue from travel. She wore scars that didn't show but were felt, scars of someone who had lived through battles rather than read about them. He had thought her presence strange then, but now in the shadow of danger, that strangeness tugged at him like instinct. "Find her," he ordered, his voice low but sharp. His second-in-command blinked. "Sir, she's just a passenger. Passengers don't carry themselves like that." Darius snapped. "She's something else. Bring her here." Word rippled through the corridors, as sailors searched the lower decks. In a small cabin tucked away, Alina Moskov sat cross-legged, the soft hum of the engines vibrating faintly beneath her. She had been avoiding notice, keeping her uniform hidden, her papers buried. She hadn't wanted to be recognized as the once brilliant strategist of the Eastern Military Command. To her this was supposed to be exile, a way to disappear. But fate had a cruel way of dragging ghosts into the light. When the knock came, she already knew. The officer's tone was careful but urgent. "Miss Moskov, the captain requests your presence, immediately." Alina closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. She had promised herself she wouldn't intervene, that she would let the world's conflicts spin without her. But the desperation in the officer's eyes, the tremor in his voice, she recognized them. She had seen them countless times in younger soldiers, who didn't want to die, who wanted to believe someone had the answers, and she had been that someone, once. Minutes later, she stood on the bridge. The atmosphere was electric, tense. Officers leaned over cracked displays, whispering about sonar contacts. Flint turned when he saw her, his imposing frame stiffening,
but his eyes betrayed a flicker of relief. "You're not who you say you are," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear but soft enough to keep from the crew. "No," Alina admitted, her voice calm, though her chest tightened. "And you're in trouble you can't fix alone." The captain's pride fought to surface, but desperation swallowed it. "We're blind. The enemy knows it. We'll be picked apart if they decide to engage. I've heard rumors about you, if even half of them are true." Alina stepped closer, scanning the broken systems, the fragments of tactical data still flickering. She moved with precision, like someone slipping into an old skin, one that still fit despite years of denial. She saw the patterns instantly, the way the enemy had staggered their patrols, the deliberate timing of their sonar sweeps. They weren't random, they were her enemy's way of herding prey. "You're being cornered," she said flatly. "But they don't know yet that you still have teeth." Flint's gaze hardened, a test of trust hanging in the silence between them. "So tell me, Moskov, do we fight, or do we run?" Her answer came without hesitation, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had decided hundreds of lives before. "We fight smart, and I'll show you how." For the first time since the storm struck, a spark of hope ignited in the captain's eyes, but beneath that hope was something else, fear. Because if this woman truly was who he suspected, then bringing her into the fold wouldn't just save his ship, it might awaken a force that the world had once been desperate to silence.
The moment the door slammed shut, Alina Moskov felt the shift in the air. The cabin was small, metal-lined and windowless, the kind of place meant to keep secrets away from prying eyes. Captain Reese hadn't left her here without reason, and though he had been polite, his request had carried an unmistakable edge of command. He wanted answers, and Alina could sense that the questions were about to cut far too close to the truths she had spent years burying. She ran her fingertips across the table bolted to the floor, noting the faint scratches etched into the steel surface. This was a room designed for interrogations, not conversations, and that alone made her pulse quicken. The military had a way of never letting you go, even after you walked away. Alina had thought she'd buried her past in classified vaults, sealed beneath layers of disavowal and deniability. Yet here she was, sitting in a locked cabin aboard a naval vessel, the very institution she had tried to vanish from pulling her back into its grip. She hadn't worn a uniform in years, but she could still feel the fabric against her skin, the insignia heavy on her chest, the weight of decisions that had shaped and destroyed lives. The sea outside churned with a restless storm, its pounding waves a mirror to the storm rising in her chest. The door opened abruptly, and Captain Reese stepped inside. His presence filled the space, not with anger, but with authority sharpened by desperation. He set a thick folder down on the table, its edges frayed, the seal on its cover unmistakably military. For a heartbeat, Alina's breath caught. She recognized that seal. Only someone with clearance at the highest level would even know this file existed. She had seen it once before, in a room half a world away, surrounded by men in suits who had spoken her name as though it were a weapon. "You're not who you claim to be," Reese said, his voice even but heavy. He slid the folder toward her, the paper whispering against steel. "Your passport says Alina Moskov, freelance translator. But this," he tapped the folder with 2 fingers, "says otherwise." Alina's instinct was to deny everything. To laugh it off, to play the civilian role she had so carefully constructed. Yet when she opened her mouth, no words came. The file's presence alone told her that the game was over. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms slowly, meeting his gaze with an expression she hadn't worn in years, the look of a soldier weighing the battlefield before making her move. "What do you want from me, Captain?" she asked, her tone steady but edged with warning. Reese didn't answer immediately. He opened the file, flipping through pages filled with black bars of redacted text, grainy surveillance photographs, and mission briefs stamped with eyes only. He paused at one particular page and turned it toward her. The image was of a younger Alina, standing amidst a squad of armed operatives, desert dust coating their uniforms. Her hair had been cropped short then, her posture straight, her gaze fierce and unflinching. The caption beneath the photo read, "Operation Iron Veil, Major A. Moskov." Her chest tightened, No matter how deeply she had buried that chapter, the past had a way of clawing itself back into the present. She had been Major Alina Moskov once, the woman called in when operations crossed the line from dangerous to impossible. She had led missions into war zones, where no backup existed, where one mistake meant entire regions collapsing into chaos. Yet she had walked away, convinced the world would be better served if she disappeared into anonymity. "Your crew is in trouble," Reese said, his voice softer now, as if he understood the weight of what he was asking. "We've intercepted chatter about an attack on this ship. Whoever they are, they know our routes, our systems, even our personnel. That's insider knowledge. And according to this," he tapped the folder again, "you're the only one on board who's faced these tactics before." Alina exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the cool steel of the table. The rational part of her screamed to refuse, to walk away from a war she no longer claimed. But another part, the soldier within, couldn't ignore what he had said. If the ship was compromised from within, then every soul aboard was in danger. Civilians, recruits, families of officers traveling incognito like she was. Innocents caught in the crossfire, just as they always were. "You're asking me to become her again," Alina murmured, her eyes dropping to the photograph. "The woman in that picture. The one I swore I'd never be." Reese leaned forward, his expression grave. "I'm not asking, I'm telling you that if you don't, we all may not make it to shore." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant thrum of the ship's engines and the muffled roar of the storm. Alina closed her eyes for a moment, memories clawing their way back, gunfire echoing through narrow alleys, the smell of burning cities, the coldness of issuing orders that cost lives to save more. She had wanted to bury all of that beneath the quiet life of a translator, to be just another face in the crowd. But perhaps the world had never meant for her to fade away. When she finally opened her eyes, something had shifted. The civilian mask she had worn so carefully was slipping, and in its place, the steel of Major Moskov gleamed once more. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Relief flashed across Reese's face, though he masked it quickly. He closed the file and locked it with a clasp, sliding it back under his arm. "First, I need you to confirm what we're dealing with. Our systems are being jammed intermittently. Our security protocols are tripping at random intervals. If this is what I think it is, they're using something called Spectre Protocol." Ring any bells? Alina's blood ran cold. The Spectre Protocol was not just a tactic, it was a ghostly system of infiltration designed to make enemies look like friends, to turn trust into a weapon. She had encountered it once, years ago, when her unit had been sent to dismantle a rogue intelligence cell. Half her squad hadn't come back. "It's worse than you think," Alina said, her voice grim. "Spectre doesn't just infiltrate your systems, it infiltrates people. Someone on this ship is already compromised. Maybe more than one." Reese's jaw tightened, but he nodded as if he had expected the answer. "Then we'll need your eyes, Major. Not the ones in the file, yours." She hesitated, then finally gave a single sharp nod. The soldier inside her had been called, and she could not unhear that call. For the first time in years, Alina Moskov felt the weight of her old self settling on her shoulders, not as a curse, but as a weapon. The storm outside howled louder, battering the vessel with merciless waves, as if the sea itself knew that a greater storm was gathering within these steel walls. Alina stood, squaring her shoulders, her decision made. The quiet traveler was gone, the soldier had returned, and the enemies who thought this ship would be their prize had no idea what they had just awakened. Captain Darius Vey stood in his private quarters with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring out at the endless stretch of gray sea. The storm from the night before still echoed in his bones, though it wasn't the waves that weighed on him now. It was the truth, pressing on his conscience, heavy, immovable, undeniable. For days, he had avoided admitting it even to himself, but there was no running from reality anymore. His crew depended on him, his ship depended on him, and most of all, the lives of every soldier and civilian they carried across those hostile waters depended on one woman. Alina Moskov. He turned when the soft knock came at his door. The sound was almost hesitant, yet precise. He didn't need to ask who it was. "Enter," he said. Alina stepped inside, no longer trying to blend in with the crew. Her posture was straight, military-trained, and her eyes were sharp, eyes that had seen far more than most men twice her age. Darius gestured toward the chair across from his desk. She sat without a word, the silence stretched between them until finally, the captain spoke. "I know who you are," he began quietly. "Or at least, I know enough." Alina's expression remained still, but a flicker of tension passed through her jaw. "And what is it you think you know, Captain?" "That you aren't just some traveler," he said. "You're former military. High level, the way you analyze, the way you command, the way you anticipate threats before they materialize, only someone with years of training could do that. You've been in operations, haven't you? Special divisions, black files, things even men like me are never cleared to see." Alina leaned back slightly, folding her arms. "Speculation is dangerous, Captain. Especially on a vessel like this, surrounded by ears that don't need to hear." Darius exhaled slowly, his lips pressing into a grim line. "I'm not asking for your past. I don't need to know who you were, or what missions you carried out. I just need to know one thing." His voice grew firmer. "Will you help us?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Alina didn't answer right away. She studied him instead, weighing every flicker of doubt, every ounce of sincerity. He wasn't lying, the captain was desperate, yes, but also honest. He needed her expertise, because his ship was heading into waters no chart could protect them from, territory patrolled by hostile forces who wouldn't hesitate to sink them. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said finally. Darius leaned forward, his knuckles on the desk. "We've intercepted encrypted communications. Patterns, movements, something is stalking us out there, waiting. My crew can handle a fight, but what we can't handle is the unknown. You've read those signals, you know how to interpret them better than anyone here. We need you to prepare us for what's coming." Alina's eyes softened for the first time, but only slightly. She remembered countless briefings in windowless rooms, where men and women like Darius had asked her to anticipate invisible threats. Only this time, the stakes weren't abstract. This time, she was trapped on the same ship, with nowhere to run if things went wrong. "You're asking me to step out of the shadows I've worked so hard to stay in," she said, her voice low. "You understand what that means?" Darius nodded. "It means we survive. Or we don't." Alina closed her eyes briefly, inhaled, then nodded once. "Very well, Captain, but if I'm going to do this, you must get logs, signals, patrol routes, crew training schedules, no more secrets." A faint smile touched Darius's lips, though it was weary. "Agreed, no more secrets." But even as he said it, a pang of guilt struck him. Because there was one secret he hadn't yet shared, one that made his request not just desperate, but dangerous. The next morning, Alina stood on the command deck, surrounded by officers who eyed her with curiosity and suspicion. She moved with the authority of someone who had worn the uniform far longer than any of them, scanning the radar, the communications relays, the sea itself. She asked questions, sharp, precise, and relentless. Crew members scrambled to keep up with her pace. "Your signal scramblers are outdated," she remarked flatly. "An enemy patrol can track us through the noise in under 10 minutes. Upgrade them immediately." One officer frowned. "We don't have replacement arrays." "Then reconfigure the shielding from your navigation relay." Alina cut him off. "It won't be perfect, but it will buy us time." The captain watched as his crew obeyed without hesitation. They might resent her, but they couldn't deny the authority in her voice. Alina was no passenger anymore. She was part of the ship, part of its survival. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind rolling waves, Darius summoned her back to his quarters. His face was pale, the lines of command etched deeper than before. "There's something I haven't told you," he admitted, his tone grave. Alina raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps it's time you did." Darius poured 2 glasses of water, his hands unsteady. He didn't offer her one, just stared into his own, as though the truth lay hidden at the bottom. This ship, it isn't just a transport vessel, we're carrying something, something classified, something the enemy would sink us 100 times over to get their hands on. Alina's breath stilled. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed tightened the weight around her chest. What exactly are you carrying, Captain? Darius met her gaze. A prototype, a weapon, one that could shift the balance of this war if it falls into the wrong hands. Silence settled thickly between them. Alina's mind raced, piecing together the patterns, the coded transmissions, the shadows stalking them across the sea. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preventing a weapon of catastrophic potential from being unleashed. You've put your entire crew at risk, she said finally, her voice like steel. Darius didn't argue. I know, then we have no choice. Alina replied, we can't just defend this ship, we have to outthink them. Anticipate their moves before they strike. You asked for my expertise, Captain, now you'll see what it truly costs. And for the first time, Darius saw the shadow of the soldier she used to be, the one who had walked away from war, only to be dragged back into its heart. But neither of them knew yet just how close the enemy had already come. The storm had always come from outside the walls. Enemy fire, aerial bombardments, the crushing threat of invasion, those were the things Alina Moskov had trained her soldiers to withstand. But this storm came from within the ranks, and when it broke, it left scars deeper than any enemy artillery strike. Alina had felt the unease days before it erupted. Whispers in the mess hall carried an edge she couldn't mistake. Too many eyes averted when she walked into a room. Too many soldiers shifting uncomfortably when her name was mentioned. She was no stranger to gossip. Command attracted envy like moths to flame, but this wasn't just idle chatter. It was coordinated, poisonous, and carefully spread. It began with a rumor that her promotion had been bought, not earned. Then came the accusation that she had falsified reports from the Eastern Front to paint herself as a hero, while others had bled and died. The venom didn't stop there. Soon there were claims that she had mishandled supply chains, deliberately leaving units undersupplied to force retreats and make her own regiment appear superior. None of it was true. Alina had led every charge from the front. She had fought through shrapnel storms, carried wounded comrades on her shoulders, and stood in blood-soaked trenches until her voice was hoarse from giving orders. But rumors don't require truth, they require fear and repetition. And someone within the military hierarchy was repeating them with surgical precision. The turning point came during a field exercise. Her unit was tasked with simulating a defensive hold against overwhelming odds. It was meant to build unity, to test coordination under pressure. But halfway through the drill, several squad leaders openly defied her orders. They acted as if her authority didn't exist, countermanding her commands, and following their own improvisations. The result was chaos. The simulated enemy cut through their defenses as if they were paper. After the exercise, she gathered her men in the courtyard. Her voice was calm, but her jaw was set like granite. Whoever questions me, she said, say it here now, to my face. Not in shadows, not in whispers. The silence was suffocating, eyes darted away. Boots scuffed against the dirt, and then one man stepped forward, Sergeant Kralin, a grizzled veteran with 20 years under his belt. His words struck like daggers. You're unfit to lead, Moskov. Everyone knows it. You climb ranks through politics, not courage. Men die under your command while you write reports to make yourself look untouchable. We don't follow cowards. The courtyard trembled with the weight of his accusation. Every soldier present held their breath, watching the face of their commander. But Alina did not flinch. She did not shout. She walked toward Kralin, until the air between them was charged with tension. I carried Corporal Ilian off the field after his legs were blown apart, she said, her voice steel wrapped in fire. I dug trenches with these hands when shovels broke. I bled in the mud with you when shells rained down. Do not speak to me of cowardice.
The silence that followed was not agreement, it was fracture. Half the men looked ashamed. The other half looked convinced that Kralen's words had planted a truth too dangerous to ignore. That night, Alina sat alone in her quarters, staring at the ceiling as the weight of betrayal pressed down on her. Leadership was not only about strength, it was about trust, and someone had poisoned hers. The truth revealed itself 2 days later, in the form of a coded message intercepted by one of her loyal scouts. The communique was traced back not to enemy spies, but to their own upper command. A colonel, ambitious and bitter, had orchestrated the campaign against her. He feared her rise. He feared the loyalty she inspired when soldiers truly knew her, and so he had planted lies, fanned doubts, and weaponized men like Kralen to break her from within. Alina crushed the paper in her fist. She had survived mortars and bullets, but this betrayal was something colder. It was war within her own house, and it meant that from now on, she would have to fight on 2 fronts against enemies beyond the border, and enemies within her very ranks. She did not crumble, she did not bend. She gathered those still loyal, trained them harder, drilled them longer, and taught them discipline so sharp it could cut through treachery. She made sure they understood that their bond was forged not in whispers, but in the fire of loyalty and truth. But she also knew the other half of her unit was already slipping away. They would never trust her fully again, and when war returned, as it always did, those fractures would either be sealed in blood, or break them entirely. The seeds of mutiny had been planted, and Alina Moskov, soldier of iron, would have to face them with everything she had, or see her command destroyed from the inside.
Alina Moskov's return to the main base after the Piotr raid wasn't a celebration. There were no bands, no parades, no open arms waiting for her. The corridors whispered about her, but the whispers were laced with something heavier than respect, fear. She had seen too much, endured too much, and moved with a precision that made her feel less like a soldier and more like a living weapon. In the fluorescent-lit hallways of the barracks, she was no longer just Alina the captain. She had become something else, something untouchable. Her superiors didn't know what to do with her. On one hand, she was the embodiment of everything they wanted, a soldier who couldn't be broken, who had returned from starvation and captivity, and turned into a force that tore through enemies like a storm. On the other hand, she was unpredictable. She didn't play politics, didn't smile at the right people, didn't bend when told to bow. She saluted with precision, yes, but her eyes cut through the men she saluted, as though she was already calculating their weaknesses. Some called her a ghost, others called her a monster. She answered to neither. She was Alina Moskov, and every breath she took was a reminder that survival was no longer her mission. It was dismantling the corruption festering inside the very military she had sworn to serve. Her nights were restless. The barracks should have been a place of camaraderie, but every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the cold walls of her prison cell, smell the metallic tang of chains, hear the hollow echo of boots outside her door. Sleep wasn't rest, it was war in another form. She rose each morning more tired than before, yet her body refused to fail her. The military had trained her for endurance, and captivity had sharpened it into something unnatural. She could push through pain the way others pushed through discomfort. She could keep going long after others collapsed. Word of her return spread beyond the base. Among the rank and file, whispers became legends. Some said she'd strangled a commander with her own chains. Others swore she had eaten snakes raw in the forest just to survive the trek back home. Myths grew because myths made sense of what men could not comprehend, that one of their own had gone through hell and returned not broken, but forged. And yet, the very thing that inspired the young recruits made the brass uneasy. Generals don't like soldiers who are larger than the system. They want war heroes who salute, smile, and fade into history books, not women who walk the halls reminding everyone of the failures the brass want buried. The whispers of promotion came with the weight of surveillance. Every step Alina took was noted, every word measured, every comrade questioned about her state of mind. She sensed it. The eyes in the shadows, the subtle shifts when she entered a room, the silence that followed her footsteps. They didn't trust her anymore, though they had draped her in medals, and she didn't care. Trust was an illusion she had left rotting in her prison cell. What mattered now was the mission. Not the mission given by the generals, but the mission written into her bones when she heard the cries of prisoners starving beside her. She had survived, but many had not. Their silence haunted her, and she would not let that silence be in vain. One night, as the barracks slept, she walked the perimeter. Her boots moved quietly, her eyes scanning the fence line, the towers, the shadows between buildings. And that's when she saw it, a figure moving where no figure should have been. A shadow too fluid, too calculated. She moved like smoke, hugging the edges of buildings, slipping between lamplight and darkness. Whoever it was, they were trained. Not a drunk soldier sneaking out, but a predator stalking the edges of the base. Alina didn't hesitate. Her body slipped into the rhythm of pursuit, every movement soundless. She shadowed the intruder, her breath shallow, her muscles poised. The figure stopped by a storage building, crouched, and began attaching something metallic to the wall. Her blood went cold. Explosives. This wasn't infiltration, this was sabotage. She lunged. The clash was silent but violent. Her arm locked around the intruder's throat, dragging them backward before the device could be placed. The figure thrashed, elbows striking, but Alina was a wall of iron. She slammed them against the ground, pinning them beneath her knee. The hood slipped free, and for a moment, her heart froze. It wasn't an enemy soldier, it wasn't a foreign spy, it was one of their own. A corporal from her unit, a man she had eaten with, trained with, marched beside. His eyes burned with something she recognized, not fear, not guilt, conviction. He spat blood, looked her dead in the eye, and hissed, "You don't understand. They deserve to burn, all of them." She tightened her grip, demanding answers, but before he could speak further, headlights swept across the yard, a jeep rolled up, and out stepped two officers. Their expressions didn't show surprise at the sight of the captured saboteur. They showed irritation that Alina had interfered. In that moment, Alina saw it clearly. The rot wasn't at the edges of the system, it was in its heart. The enemy wasn't just across borders, the enemy was here, wearing the same uniform, saluting the same flag, smiling the same fake smiles. And they had been watching her all along, waiting to see whether she would play the obedient hero, or the dangerous truth-teller. She dragged the corporal upright, and shoved him toward the officers. Their hands tightened on their belts, not to restrain him, but to silence him. She stepped between them, her voice a razor. "He's a traitor, he needs a tribunal. The truth must come out." The officers exchanged a glance, and then with a smirk, one said, "Captain Moskov, some truths are too dangerous for soldiers to hear." That night, the corporal disappeared. No tribunal, no interrogation. By dawn the barracks were told he had been transferred to another unit. No one asked questions. No one except Alina. The ghost in the barracks had become something more than legend. She had become a threat. And in the high offices of the brass, plans were being drawn not for the next war, but for how to deal with their most unpredictable weapon, the woman who refused to be silenced. The whispers had started long before the official reports reached Alina's desk. A shipment of classified communications equipment had gone missing somewhere between a supply depot in Poland and a naval station in the Black Sea. At first, it seemed like an isolated theft, the kind of smuggling that sometimes happened in border regions. But the timing was too perfect, too clean, and the missing equipment was the kind of technology that could cripple entire battalions if it fell into enemy hands. Alina sat at her desk in the underground command center, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and metallic wiring. She stared at the logistics reports, the dates, the shipping codes, and the signatures. One name kept recurring, Major Anton Resnick, a man who had once been one of her closest allies during joint exercises. Resnick was known for his charm, his easy way of winning over both soldiers and bureaucrats. He had defended Alina in the early days when commanders mocked her youth. Yet now, his name kept popping up in connection with the missing shipments. Her instincts screamed. This wasn't incompetence, this was betrayal. She summoned her second-in-command, Captain Verer Deskov, a woman she trusted with her life. "Resnick's shadow is all over these transfers," Alina said, sliding the papers across the steel table. "But if I accuse him without proof, it'll look like a personal vendetta. Ferrer leaned forward, studying the numbers. Resnick has friends in high places. If he's dirty, he's not working alone. The thought twisted in Alina's stomach. A traitor within the chain of command wasn't just a problem, it was a cancer that could rot the entire structure of trust. Worse, it meant lives were already at risk. The missing communications equipment wasn't just machinery. It was encrypted hardware capable of exposing troop movements, supply lines, and battlefield strategies. If the enemy possessed it, entire divisions could be ambushed and slaughtered. The days that followed blurred into nights of investigation. Alina moved carefully, questioning clerks, inspecting manifests, and quietly following trails others overlooked. Every thread pointed back to Resnick. He had access, authority, and the charisma to mask his crimes. Yet, as much as Alina wanted to storm into his office and demand the truth, she knew better. Resnick was clever. If he suspected she was onto him, he'd vanish, or worse, accelerate his sabotage. The breakthrough came in the form of an encrypted call, intercepted by signals intelligence. Buried beneath layers of static, a voice Alina recognized as Resnick spoke in clipped tones, arranging a meeting on the outskirts of Odessa. The recipient's voice was unfamiliar, but the words were chilling. The equipment is en route. Payment upon delivery. Alina's blood ran cold. This was no rumor. This was treason. She requested authorization for a covert operation, but her superiors hesitated. Resnick had influence, allies, and a spotless public record. You're asking us to sanction the arrest of a decorated officer on what might be circumstantial evidence, one general warned. Alina slammed her fist against the table. With respect, sir, if we wait for ironclad proof, Resnick will deliver every secret we hold to our enemies. This isn't just betrayal, it's war. The room went quiet. Finally, reluctantly, she was given permission, but not official support. She would lead the mission herself, with only her most trusted soldiers at her side. If they failed, she would bear the consequences alone. The night of the operation, Odessa was cloaked in a damp fog that clung to every shadow. Alina and her small team moved through the deserted industrial district, the distant hum of ships on the Black Sea echoing through the night. They set up surveillance near a decaying warehouse, where Resnick was expected to meet his contact. Hours passed, then headlights pierced the darkness. A convoy of unmarked trucks rolled in, engines purring low. From the lead vehicle stepped Major Resnick, his polished boots striking the gravel with an almost arrogant rhythm. Beside him masked men unloaded crates, the stolen equipment. Alina's heart hammered in her chest. She had trusted this man. He had once toasted her promotions, had spoken of loyalty and service. Now he was bargaining with the enemy. Her voice was cold when she whispered into her comms, "Move." The night erupted. Her team surged forward, weapons raised, catching Resnick and his men off guard. Bullets sparked against steel as shouts echoed across the yard. The air filled with smoke, chaos, and the metallic sting of gunfire. Resnick fought like a cornered wolf, drawing his pistol and firing at shadows. His eyes locked onto Alina's across the battlefield, recognition flashing before turning to venom. "You should have stayed silent," he snarled, retreating behind a crate. But Alina did not falter. She advanced through the chaos, her voice steady, commanding her soldiers as if the world itself depended on their victory. And in many ways it did, for every crate recovered meant lives saved, futures preserved. The firefight dragged on until Resnick realized the battle was lost. He tried to flee, sprinting toward the trucks. Alina intercepted him, slamming him against the steel frame of a vehicle. Their faces were inches apart, the betrayal burning between them. "Why?" she demanded, her voice raw with rage. Resnick smirked, even as blood trickled down his temple. "Because loyalty is a game for fools. Power, Alina, is the only real currency, and I intend to own it." Her jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, she wanted to end him right there, to silence his treachery forever. But she knew the truth was more valuable alive than dead. Resnick would face trial, his crimes exposed to all. The operation ended with the recovery of the stolen equipment and the capture of the traitor. But victory was not sweet. Alina returned to base,
knowing the rot went deeper than one man. Resnick's arrogance revealed connections, hints of a network that extended beyond her reach. That night, as she sat in her office staring at the reports, she understood something terrible. This wasn't just Resnick's betrayal, it was the first crack in a much larger conspiracy. And unless she acted swiftly, the military she had given her life to defend would be torn apart from within. Alina clenched her fists, her voice a whisper in the dim silence. If there are others, I will find them, and I will burn their empire to the ground. The war outside was brutal, but the war within, the war of loyalty, treachery, and shadows, was about to become her deadliest battle yet. The hall was silent. Rows of generals, ministers and foreign dignitaries filled the war tribunal's chamber, their expressions a mixture of awe, unease and reluctant respect. At the center, under the light that fell like a spotlight, stood Alina Moskov, her uniform torn from countless battles, yet worn with an authority no metal could outshine. She had become a myth in her own lifetime. They once called her unfit. They once said she was too broken to serve, too fragile to command, too haunted by the scars of her past. But now, the very people who had doubted her, gathered to witness what could no longer be denied. She had not only survived, she had led her nation to its greatest military redemption. Alina did not stand for herself, she stood for every soldier abandoned in captivity, every veteran silenced by bureaucracy, and every woman who had been told she did not belong in the harsh machinery of war. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation as the chief councilman leaned forward. "Colonel Moskov," he said, his voice heavy with formality, "these proceedings have been convened not only to review the aftermath of the Black Dagger campaign, but to determine your fate in the military. You have so profoundly changed." Alina met his eyes. Her voice carried the weight of both steel and sorrow. "With respect, councilman, I don't need them to determine my fate. The war already did that." A murmur swept the room. She began to recount the campaign, not with triumph, but with brutal honesty. How the Black Dagger insurgency had infiltrated military strongholds across 3 borders. How betrayal within their own ranks had left entire battalions slaughtered. How she had walked into enemy-controlled zones with no promise of extraction, armed with little more than tactical improvisation, and the trust of the soldiers who followed her. Her voice faltered only once, when she spoke of the prisoners she liberated from those iron cages buried in the ground. Men and women who had been forgotten, starved, beaten until their uniforms rotted from their bodies. "I knew what they felt," she said quietly, "because once that was me." Every officer in the hall knew her history. Captured as a young cadet, locked away in a camp where food was withheld, days blurred into nights, and the will to live was tested like a weapon. That chapter of her life had nearly destroyed her, but it was also the crucible that had shaped the commander now standing before them. When she finished speaking, silence held the room. Even the sound of pens scratching on paper had stopped. Then General Rodchenko rose. He was one of her oldest critics, the man who had once told her she was a liability, that she should retire quietly, instead of dragging her trauma into the service. Now his voice was unsteady. "Colonel Moskov," he said, "what you did in the Black Dagger campaign saved not just battalions, not just cities, but the very credibility of this army. You turned the tide where every doctrine said it was impossible. If there is anyone still foolish enough to question your place in our history, let them stand now." No one moved. Alina's gaze swept across the chamber. It wasn't victory she sought, it was recognition of those who had bled beside her. "Don't etch my name in your records without theirs," she said firmly. "Every soldier I commanded, every soul who gave their life in those fields, is why you're free to sit in this hall today. If you remember me, remember them first." Her words struck like artillery. The council deliberated, but it was already clear. By evening the declaration was read aloud. Colonel Alina Moskov was to be promoted to general, awarded the nation's highest honor for valor, and given command over a newly formed multinational defense alliance. But titles meant little to her. It wasn't the stars on her shoulder that mattered, it was the future. Weeks later, in the training grounds of an old fortress, Alina stood before rows of recruits. Some were barely out of adolescence, others were veterans, scarred but unbroken, drawn back to the uniform by her example. Their faces reflected the same doubts she had once carried. "You will be told you're not strong enough," she said, pacing before them. "You will be told your past defines you, that you are too small, too weak, too damaged. I am living proof that they are wrong." Her voice carried beyond the walls, into the cold air. The battlefield does not belong to those who fit a mold. It belongs to those who refuse to break. The recruits straightened. Some clenched their fists. Some fought back tears. Alina's own chest ached, not from injury, but from the weight of legacy. She realized then that her greatest battle had never been fought against insurgents, or traitors, or even the chains of her own captivity. Her greatest battle had been proving that one soldier's resilience could ignite an army's will to fight again. Years passed, wars came and went, but the name Alina Moskov did not fade. In academies her campaigns became case studies. In barracks her quotes were carved into walls. In the whispered prayers of soldiers marching into unknown lands, her memory lived as a shield. One day, standing on a balcony overlooking the capital, Alina removed her uniform for the last time. Her body bore scars that no surgeon could erase, but her eyes burned with unyielding clarity. She thought of the prison cell where her journey began. She thought of the soldiers who had followed her into the storm. She thought of the promise she had made, to never let silence bury the forgotten, and she knew she had kept. Alina Moskov was no longer just a soldier. She was a legacy, etched into the marrow of a nation, carried by every man and woman who dared to believe that defiance could outlast despair. They had once locked her away without food, trying to break her. But all they had done was feed the fire that turned her into a legend. And legends never starve. The gavel's echo still rang in the air long after the courtroom emptied. Alina Moskov stood at the threshold, sunlight cutting across her uniform like a blade of fire. The verdict had been spoken, the guilty condemned, but the true weight of justice lay not in the words of judges, but in the silence that followed. That silence belonged to her, and she carried it like a weapon. The military brass who once turned away from her now stood in forced recognition. Her name once whispered in dismissal, now rippled across the ranks as a challenge, a warning and a standard. Every soldier who had doubted her strength, every officer who had mocked her resilience, now measured themselves against the woman who had survived the impossible and burned the truth into stone. But Alina was not finished. She had no intention of fading into the shadows of history as a single trial's victory. Her war was not over, it had simply shifted theaters. The first summons came from the Eastern Military Tribunal, where war crimes were dissected in painstaking detail. Generals from across the world sat in polished uniforms, medals glittering, trying to hide the rot beneath. They expected her to be broken, perhaps grateful for their recognition, a pawn to parade. Instead she walked in with her scars unhidden. Her uniform fit like armor, her eyes colder than the steel of their swords. When she took the stand, silence choked the hall. The judges leaned forward, the cameras flashed, and Alina Moskov, survivor of cruelty, veteran forged in shadows, spoke not as a victim, but as a soldier. "I do not stand here to beg for sympathy," she said, her voice steady as gunfire. "I stand here to remind you that no uniform, no flag, no rank gives you the right to desecrate the dignity of those who serve beneath it. If you wish to wear command, then bear the weight of honor. If you cannot, then know that the silence of the soldiers you abuse will one day rise and speak louder than any general's voice. I am that silence, and I am not alone." The chamber erupted, not with applause. Soldiers do not applaud in tribunal, but with a subtle undeniable sound of truth landing like an artillery shell. Some officers looked away, others clenched their fists, but many younger and untainted straightened their backs as if Alina's words had given them new spine. Her influence began to spread beyond speeches. A program was drafted in her name, the Moskov Protocol, designed to root out abuse within the ranks. At first it was a token gesture, something officials thought would pacify her supporters. But Alina seized it. She rewrote its language, sharpened its directives, and personally led the first inspections. Corruption that had festered for decades was dragged into daylight. Commanders who thought themselves untouchable were court-martialed, and soldiers who had hidden their pain finally had a shield. Of course, the resistance came just as fiercely. Threats were sent to her door, warnings carved into the metal of her vehicle, shadows moving in the periphery of her nights. They wanted her afraid, they wanted her silent, but they had forgotten one thing. Alina Moskov had already been broken once, and she had rebuilt herself from steel. Fear could not reach her, not anymore. The global stage awaited her next. Nations at the United Military Council debated whether her reform should be adopted beyond her own borders. Some feared her influence, calling her dangerous, disruptive, a soldier who had stepped beyond her place. But others recognized her for what she was, not a danger, but a revolution, given flesh. Alina stood before them in that grand hall, her medals gleaming, not as decoration, but as reminders of every drop of blood that had been shed, hers and others. She did not flatter, did not beg, did not negotiate. She simply declared, "Soldiers are not pawns. We are the ones who bleed when leaders gamble. We are the ones who carry the weight of wars we did not start. And we are the ones who die when honor is abandoned. I will not allow another generation to be devoured by silence. If you call me dangerous, then you are right, because I am dangerous to corruption. I am dangerous to predators. I am dangerous to those who think uniforms excuse dishonor, and I will never be anything less." The words were broadcast across continents. Young cadets replayed them in dormitories. Veterans in quiet bars nodded into their drinks. Even civilians, far from the battlefield, felt the tremor of truth. But victory was not without cost. The more Alina fought, the more she sacrificed. Sleep became a luxury. Trust, a rarer currency still. Her body bore the toll of scars, not just from her torture, but from years of constant battles. There were days her ribs ached so badly, she struggled to breathe. Nights when the old wounds flared like fire under her skin. Yet she pressed on, not because she was unbreakable, but because she refused to let breaking be the end. In quieter hours, she found herself at memorial walls, tracing the names of the fallen, with calloused fingers. She whispered to them, not prayers, but promises, that their sacrifices would not vanish into the silence of forgotten wars, that as long as she lived, their memory had teeth, their memory had voice, their memory had vengeance. The final chapter of her campaign came not in a courtroom or council hall, but on the parade ground, where she had once been mocked, dismissed, underestimated. Now thousands stood assembled, rows of cadets, polished boots, eyes locked on her with something she had never expected, reverence. Banners hung in the wind, and for once they were not the banners of politicians, but the emblem of her reform. A blade crossed with an open hand, the mark of honor and strength united. Alina walked to the podium, her step slow, steady, weighted with memory. The scars on her face caught the sun like lightning. When she spoke, her voice carried across the grounds, across the world. Once they thought they could break me. Once they believed my silence would serve them. But silence does not mean weakness. Silence means listening. Silence means remembering. And when silence finally speaks, it speaks with the voice of every soldier who came before, and every soldier who will come after. I am not here because I survived. I am here because I refused to surrender. And now so will you. The parade ground thundered, not with applause, but with the synchronized strike of thousands of boots against concrete. A soldier's salute, a soldier's vow. Alina Moskov did not fade into history. She became history. Her name etched into textbooks, her protocols into law, her story into the blood of every army that dared forget the cost of dishonor. And though the years would wear her body, though the battles of reform would never truly end, she had already won the war that mattered most. Because Alina Moskov had turned her silence into a weapon, and with it she carved a legacy no army could erase. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.